Please welcome Van Johnson. You're holding your ears there.
You know, the next generation, Mr. Letterman, are going to be born deaf.
At 70, Van Johnson finally admitted what Hollywood had worked so hard to hide. Behind the bright smile and boy-next-door charm, there was a carefully arranged marriage designed not for love, but for protection. The studio wanted to preserve his all-American image, even if it meant covering up a secret affair with another man. In an industry built on illusion, his private truth was considered a dangerous liability. Can you imagine being forced into a wedding just to keep your career alive? That was the reality for Van Johnson, one of MGM's most bankable stars of the 1,940 seconds. To understand how a small-town boy ended up trapped inside the golden machine of Hollywood, we have to begin at the very start. Van Johnson was born Charles Vandell Johnson in 1,916 inches, Newport, Rhode Island. Newport was a city of contrasts, where the wealthy elite summered in sprawling mansions while working families like the Johnsons scraped by with modest means. His childhood was scarred by abandonment. When Van was still young, his mother walked out of the marriage and disappeared from his life. The loss left a wound that never fully healed. His father, a reserved man who worked in real estate, was not affectionate. Van grew up craving attention, warmth, and acceptance, feelings he would later find under the stage lights. The 1,920 seconds roared around him, with jazz spilling from radios, flappers challenging old rules, and movies flickering on silver screens. Yet small-town Rhode Island clung to conservative values. For a boy like Van, dreamy and drawn to performance, fitting in was difficult. He spent hours at the local movie theater, soaking in the glamour of Fred Astaire, the wit of Cary Grant, and the elegance of Jeanette MacDonald. Those stars offered escape and possibility, a world where he could be admired instead of overlooked. Van's love for the stage began early. He joined school productions and found a rush of belonging whenever the curtain rose. Offstage, though, whispers followed. He was tall, thin, and naturally graceful, traits that some mocked as effeminate. In a world where masculinity was rigidly defined, Van learned to mask his sensitivity. Performance became his shield, humor his defense, and charm his armor. By the 1,930 seconds, the Great Depression gripped America. Breadlines stretched down streets. Families sold heirlooms to survive. Van, restless and ambitious, longed to escape. New York City was only a train ride away, and Broadway called like a beacon. He started making trips, first as a hopeful spectator, and then as a determined student of theater. He danced in small ensembles, waited tables, and took whatever work paid his rent. Those years hardened his resolve. Success would not come easily, but rejection only sharpened his hunger. Culturally, America was shifting. Prohibition ended. Swing bands filled ballrooms. The Hays Code, introduced in 1934, imposed moral restrictions on film, dictating not just what could be shown on screen, but how actors off-screen were expected to behave. Homosexuality, already stigmatized, was pushed further into secrecy. For a young man like Van, whose personal desires were beginning to awaken, the message was clear: hide. The glittering dream of Hollywood came with an iron lock on private truth. What propelled him forward was his optimism. Friends remembered him as eager, outgoing, and always ready with a smile. That sunny exterior became his calling card, but behind it lay the scars of abandonment and the quiet knowledge that he was different. Broadway gave him his first taste of belonging, but it was the golden lure of Hollywood that promised both fame and the risk of total exposure. Van Johnson arrived in New York during the late 1,930 seconds with nothing but ambition and a suitcase. The Great White Way was alive with neon and the sound of tap shoes echoing on stage. Van worked tirelessly, picking up small chorus parts in musicals, rehearsing late into the night, and slowly building a reputation as a dependable young performer. His break came when he landed a spot as a dancer in George Abbott's stage productions, where his boyish good looks and energy caught attention. By the early 1,940 seconds, Hollywood was hunting for fresh faces. Van's freckled charm and natural warmth seemed tailor-made for the screen. Lucille Ball, already an established actress, noticed him and recommended him for film work. That single act of kindness changed the course of his life. Soon, he was signed by Warner Brothers and then moved to MGM, the studio that would transform him into a household name. MGM marketed him as the clean-cut, all-American boy, a symbol of optimism during a world at war. Then fate intervened. In 1943, Van was in a serious car accident. His face was cut badly, and doctors predicted it might end his career. Yet MGM, needing new leading men while others served in the war, rallied behind him. Spencer Tracy visited his hospital room, reassuring him that scars could add character. When Van healed, he emerged not just intact but with a new depth in his features that audiences found endearing. That accident, instead of ending his career, catapulted him into stardom. His breakthrough came with the 1943 film A Guy Named Joe, alongside Spencer Tracy and Irene Dunne. The role, patriotic and sincere, cemented him as a symbol of American resilience. During World War II, Van was exempted from military service due to his injuries, which allowed him to continue acting while many contemporaries went overseas. He became the face of wartime hope, starring in hits like 30 Seconds Over Tokyo in 1944, where his earnestness won over audiences and critics alike. By the late 1940 seconds, Van Johnson was one of MGM's top stars. He danced, sang, and acted with a versatility that studios prized. He shared the screen with June Allison, Esther Williams, and Judy Garland. His easy smile and friendly demeanor made him beloved by fans who felt they could trust him. He was the boy you could bring home to your parents, the safe choice in a dangerous world. Magazines called him the voiceless Sinatra, and fan clubs sprang up across the country. But fame carried pressure. The studio system demanded not just professional performance, but personal perfection. Rumors swirled constantly about stars, and any hint of scandal could ruin a career. Van's charm was genuine, but whispers about his private life began to circulate. MGM knew they had a valuable star whose appeal depended on his image as a clean-cut romantic lead. To maintain that illusion, they tightened their grip. Behind the lights, Van was beginning to feel the strain of living two lives, one for the cameras and another hidden in the shadows. Hollywood in the 1940 seconds and 1950 seconds was a world of bright lights and darker corners. Behind every sparkling premiere and choreographed photo spread, there were private gatherings shielded from reporters and morality enforcers. Van Johnson moved easily in both realms. To the public, he was MGM's golden boy. In hidden spaces, he searched for connection that could never be made public. Friends and biographers have noted that Van was deeply drawn to men, though he kept such feelings tightly controlled. Hollywood provided places where men could meet discreetly: apartment parties in Beverly Hills, secret gatherings at Malibu beach houses, even backstage dressing rooms became sanctuaries of fleeting freedom. It was within those circles that Van reportedly formed close attachments with dancers, actors, and stage performers who understood the risks. These were not loud romances but coded exchanges of glances, private dinners, and shared weekends under assumed pretenses. One of the most discussed relationships linked to Van was with a male dancer during his MGM years. They reportedly met during rehearsals for a musical sequence and grew close, traveling together when the studio's watchful eye could be diverted. The bond was affectionate and intense, but it lived in secrecy. If discovered, it would have ended Van's career overnight. The studio's answer to such dangers was control. MGM executives arranged his marriage to Eve Abbott, the former wife of actor Keenan Wynn. The timing was no accident. Gossip about Van had begun to build, and a marriage was the simplest way to silence whispers. Eve herself acknowledged later that the marriage was orchestrated, more business than passion. Van played the role dutifully. Photographers captured smiling domestic scenes, the image of a happy couple. But insiders knew the truth. The marriage served the studio, not his heart. Behind closed doors, Van's real affections remained with men, though fear kept him from living openly. The industry operated under strict morality clauses, and homosexuality was not only stigmatized but considered grounds for contract termination. Stars were forced to hide or risk everything. Despite the tension, Van did find pockets of joy. He formed bonds with fellow actors who lived similar double lives. At private parties hosted by stars like Cole Porter, he mingled freely without the weight of studio handlers. Biographers mention friendships with men like Clifton Webb and hints of romantic ties that could never be spoken aloud. In these hidden worlds, he could laugh more freely, dance without worry, and be himself for a few precious hours. But the risk was constant. Confidential magazine, notorious for exposing Hollywood secrets, loomed like a shadow. Every encounter carried the possibility of betrayal. Van walked a tightrope, balancing genuine need for love against the peril of discovery. The tension grew heavier as his fame climbed higher. He was not alone in this struggle, but few carried it as publicly polished as Van Johnson, the man who looked like America's sweetheart, yet longed for a freedom America would not allow. By the mid-1950s, Van Johnson's perfect image began to crack. The studio-arranged marriage provided cover, but it did not silence gossip. Hollywood was a small town disguised as a global stage, and whispers traveled quickly. Stories of Van's nights at private parties, or his closeness with certain male companions, reached reporters who were hungry for scandal. Confidential magazine, infamous for destroying careers, began circling. For any star, especially one packaged as a clean-cut romantic lead, exposure was a death sentence. MGM tightened its control. Public appearances with his wife were staged with increasing frequency. Photographers were invited into their home, producing glossy spreads of supposed domestic bliss. Yet fans sensed distance. Van's smile never dimmed, but behind it was fatigue. He was living in constant fear of being unmasked, a man pretending, even when the cameras stopped rolling. The pressure affected his career. By the late 1950s, MGM's golden era was fading. Television eroded box office dominance, and younger stars replaced the wartime idols. Van's wholesome image felt dated compared to the rebellious energy of actors like Marlon Brando and James Dean. His box office draw weakened, and roles grew scarcer. Studios were less willing to protect him as profits dipped. For Van, the risk of being discarded was no longer theoretical. He felt it with each passing year. The emotional toll was immense. Friends recalled his mood swings, his growing loneliness, and his dependence on the reassurance of fans. He toured theaters, performed on stage, and kept smiling for autographs, but inside, he carried the weight of concealment. Living in secrecy meant never fully trusting anyone. A slip of the tongue, a careless word, could undo decades of work. The more he concealed, the more isolated he became. Meanwhile, society grew harsher. The 1950s were an era of conformity and fear. Senator McCarthy's Red Scare targeted not only communists but anyone deemed subversive. Homosexuals were purged from government jobs in what was called the Lavender Scare. Hollywood reflected that paranoia. Executives wanted stars who reassured middle America, not those who challenged moral boundaries. For Van, whose truth placed him at odds with the culture, survival meant silence. By the end of the decade, the boy-next-door image that had once lifted him now trapped him. He could not shift into darker, more complex roles, because studios feared it would invite questions. He could not reveal his private life without losing everything. The man who had embodied optimism on screen found himself cornered, with fame no longer a shield but a cage. By the 1960s, Van Johnson's career had shifted. The movie musical era was waning, and the studios that once controlled every detail of their stars' lives were losing power. Van adapted as best he could, moving into stage productions, television guest spots, and international projects. He toured with musicals like The Music Man and Damn Yankees, where his natural charm still drew applause from audiences who remembered his film days. In Europe, especially in Britain, he found a welcoming stage and appreciative crowds. Yet personally, he remained cautious. The end of his marriage left him unanchored, but it also freed him from the pretense of domestic bliss. Though still guarded, he began allowing himself more authentic relationships. Friends later spoke of a male partner with whom he shared a quieter companionship during his later life. These bonds were less about glamour and more about trust. For a man who had spent decades hiding, simple companionship was a profound relief. The world around him was changing too. By the 1970s, gay rights movements were challenging old prejudices. Stonewall had happened, and conversations about sexuality were entering public life. But for someone of Van's generation, stepping forward publicly was unthinkable. He carried too many scars from years of secrecy. He watched quietly as younger actors began pushing boundaries he never could. There was pride, but also sorrow, in knowing he had lived under harsher rules. Still, Van remained a beloved figure. He embraced stage touring, connecting with fans who remembered him as the wartime heartthrob. He also became a fixture in New York, where he lived a quieter life in later decades. Unlike some contemporaries, he avoided scandal in old age, choosing instead to maintain dignity. Those who knew him described him as gracious, witty, and appreciative of the affection he still received. As time passed, Van seemed to make peace with his complicated past. He never publicly declared his sexuality, but in private conversations, he acknowledged truths that had once been dangerous to admit. The boy who once sought approval from an absent mother and a distant father found a kind of family among friends, colleagues, and loyal admirers. His later years were marked not by headlines but by resilience, proof of a man who endured Hollywood's cruelest demands and still carried a smile. In reflection, Van's life mirrored Hollywood itself, glittering on the surface, complicated beneath. He was both a product of his time and a victim of it, forced into silence but remembered for warmth. And as age softened the sharp edges of his fears, he became a living reminder of the cost of survival in an era that demanded perfection at any price. Van Johnson's story is not just about one man's career. It is about the price of living in a world where truth was forbidden and where even love had to be hidden behind locked doors. He was forced into a marriage not of his choosing, pushed to maintain an image crafted by others, and silenced by fear of exposure. Yet through it all, he gave audiences hope, laughter, and a vision of decency during some of America's darkest years. His legacy is bittersweet. Fans remember the cheerful boy next door who danced across screens and carried the spirit of wartime resilience. But beneath that surface was a man who longed for freedom, who carried the burden of secrets too heavy to share. His life reminds us of the countless stars who played roles off-screen as well as on, forced to act every day of their lives just to survive. Today, as society grows more open, his story takes on new meaning. It is not a tale of scandal but of survival, not one of shame but of endurance. Van Johnson's courage was quiet, but it was real. He endured so others might someday live more freely. That is the true measure of his legacy. What do you think of Van Johnson's hidden story? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more untold Hollywood histories, make sure to like, subscribe, and join us again.